cellular agriculture draws closer into reality, the question of how farmers and conventional producers of food might contribute to the field has often been raised. What do farmers think, and how might farmers and existing modes of food production be affected by such a potentially disruptive technology? This conversation between two of the leading voices in the future production of cultured meat, Mark Post of Maastricht University and the company Mosa Meat, and David Kay of Memphis Meats, and two farmers, I'm going to try to say your name correctly, Illtud Dunsford and Richard Fowler, who have traveled all the way from Wales and New Zealand respectively, and moderator Danielle Gould, founder and CEO of the appropriately named Food+Tech Connect, is a long-awaited one. We hope that this panel discussion will not only begin to answer some of these very important questions, but that it will spark a broader and ongoing conversation as well. So it is my pleasure to hand the floor over to Danielle and our panel, and I hope that you enjoy.
Hi, everyone. So we're really excited to have a conversation that doesn't usually happen, where we have farmers and traditional farmers and cellular agriculturists talking about what the implications are for a cellular future. I'm just going to introduce the panelists very quickly, and then we'll get started with some questions. We're going to leave a lot of time because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions from the audience as well. Sitting next to me, we have Richard Fowler, who is a farmer from New Zealand. He and his wife farm 1,000 dairy cows over 2 farms, and their wider families also produce beef, lamb, wool, and kiwi fruit. He is an interesting case because in 2016, he received a scholarship to travel around the world, and he chose to study the synthetic food as a topic. Next, we have Mark Post, who is a medical doctor who's had several appointments as an assistant professor at the Utrecht University, Harvard University, as an associate professor at Dartmouth College, and as a full professor at the University of Technology and Maastricht University. He's also most well known for presenting the world's first hamburger from cultured beef in August 2013, and he's been working on improvements on scaling up production. He has spun out 3 companies based on his research. Next, we have David Kay, who's the head of mission at Memphis Meats, a startup that many of you probably know that's developing a way to make meat from animal cells without the need to feed, breed, or slaughter actual animals. And last, we have Illtud Dunsford, sorry on the pronunciation, who's a Welsh farmer, an agri-food consultant, and owner of Charcutier Ltd, a specialist meat processing business. He also is a no-field farming scholar and traveled around the world for a year. And through that, he decided to launch a biotech startup called Cellular Agriculture Limited. So the first question is for both of the farmers. How do you feel about the prospect of a post-animal bioeconomy?
I guess as a farmer, we're all about producing food from the land or products from the land. So ultimately, if there's a better way to do it, if there's proven to be a better way to do it than with animals, then we've got to be open to that. And if it's economically more viable to do it, or because the market resists animal products, then ultimately who are we to stand in the way and say that we've got to keep doing this? So I'm open-minded, but at the same time, I think the jury's still out on until products are on the market and that sort of thing. I think the jury's still out a wee bit on how it'll play out, I guess, yeah.
Is that how your peers view this prospect as well?
Oh, I wouldn't say so, no. It's interesting. It's been really interesting in New Zealand because I've been looking to this for only two years, really, which is not that long. But in that time, when I started talking to people about that I was going to go overseas and study this topic, they sort of looked at me sideways and changed the conversation pretty fast, or or just said flatly, oh, it's just silly, it'll never take off. Whereas now you go to a conference at home and the guest speaker will usually mention cell cultured food or synthetic food. So it's really on the radar now, and it's in most of the farming papers regularly about how it could play out and what the implications could be for farming. So it's definitely on the radar, because New Zealand's a very export focused country, so we're really conscious of what's happening in the rest of the world, and probably a bit self-conscious. So I would say actually the general perception is reasonably negative at the moment, actually, from farmers, because it's been presented as a disruptive innovation that's going to take over and basically wipe out farming, sort of thing. And it's a shame it's been portrayed that way, because in my travels and stuff, I didn't get that impression from the people, the likes of Mark, that are having a crack at it. They've got genuine sort of reasons for trying, and they didn't seem to be trying to take over the world.
What about you, Illtud?
I kind of agree in terms of, for farmers, what we're told is that we're faced with the challenge of feeding a growing population by 2050. And with the tools that we currently have as farmers, it's probably an impossibility. So we need to use as many tools that are at our disposal. And this is how I view this sort of growing industry. When we refer to agriculture, I think it's dangerous somewhat. The images that we've seen on the slides this morning all refer to intensively farmed agriculture. That isn't what everything is. And I'm very much from a sustainable agricultural background. And the reason I think I came to this was because I felt that I was preaching to the converted in the work that I was doing, or the work that I am doing in that field. And that this is something that it takes the choice away from the consumer. It's not about the consumer choosing to buy organic or to buy grass-fed or to do those things. You're just putting an alternative there that's cheaper, and people buy based on cost. And if you can do that you ultimately change a whole system just based on cost. So you're just taking that choice away from them. But it's, it is a challenge in terms of engaging with farmers. I know when I presented my scholarship at the end of the 2 years, I was faced with sort of 350 farmers who are the top 1% in the UK, and there was just stony silence in the room. And one of my co-scholars, there's a kind of an unwritten rule: you don't challenge your co-scholars when it comes to questioning at the end of the presentation. And there was a Scottish farmer who just got up and he was at me straight away, going, "How is this going to affect my farm?" And so it's it's not seen as an opportunity, but it should be seen, because for us to retain the natural biodiversity that we have in the world from all our animal breeds, this could be an opportunity of how we kind of tackle that.
So could you talk a little bit more about the opportunity that you see for farmers?
Absolutely. So for us as a producer, we use rare breeds, and they're breeds that have evolved naturally within each country based on the natural environment. I mean, one of the other slides this morning was about extreme weather and how a certain number of animals had died. Well, realistically, that type of animal agriculture could change by changing the breed. If you think of tropical breeds of cattle, if in Texas they can't use the Angus and Hereford that's traditionally used, there's the possibility of changing to a more tropical breed. Well, that same, those animals have evolved naturally within the world, and they could be the base source of this, the primary cell that's used within this technology. Because unlike traditional animal agriculture or intensive animal agriculture, you're looking for an efficient animal. That's an animal that grows quickly and produces yield. For me as a food producer, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for what has the best flavor and what has the best nutritional content. And so that primary cell that we need to produce cultured meat, we don't yet know whether all these native breeds that we have naturally in the world, they may hold that base information to actually create a much better product than just taking from what we currently have within intensive systems.
And Richard, for you, what do you think the opportunity is for the farmers in your community?
Yeah, so that's a hard one for New Zealand. I guess in that with the population of 4.5 million, 95% of our produce goes overseas, it's exported, so we've got really a very small domestic market. Therefore, if we're faced with exporting a cell-cultured product, we're just up against everyone else in the world, and we've really got no differentiation. So it's a tough one, actually, to be honest. And the other thing is, if we're looking at as an opportunity of, because ultimately the likes of these guys are going to need, I guess, a source of, feed source to grow their products and stuff, which is, I guess, going to come from the arable sector, from cropping, that sort of thing. And there's parts of that in New Zealand, but generally it's pastoral grazing systems in New Zealand, so free range, pasture stuff. So for farmers, the opportunities, they're there, I guess, in pockets of cropping, but reasonably limited, I would think, other than going down the track of what Illtud's talking about. I think possibly that's part of where the resistance is coming from too, is that people can't actually see much of an opportunity.
And Mark and David, so where do you see opportunities for working with the agricultural communities, and in what ways are you already, or do you plan to work with farmers?
Well, very much like Richard says, those cells need to be fed too, and that comes from vegetable sources or producers, but now goes into an ag cell type of industry. So there's a lot of interest in that because farmers are, as you already have heard, are also for me sort of the ultimate entrepreneurs. They will do whatever is required to get value from their land. And they have a hard enough job, and they have also, and it's also illustrated that it's hard because you find less and less young people attracted to this type of business, and that should be our real concern, right? That we won't have enough farmers in the future to produce our food. And that's where also these technologies, I think, might help, because when I look now at sort of the future farmers, they're basically my students, right? And they are attracted to this field. They want to work in this field. So there's all sorts of opportunities, but you have to create the narratives and create the understanding that this is a potential future also for farmers and also for feed producers.
Yeah, and I would just add two things. Oh, sweet.
Test? Cool. I would just add two things. I agree with what has been said so far. The first thing that I would add is that at Memphis Meats, we like to say we're not out to transform family farms, we're out to transform factory farms. I think there's likely a place in feeding the very hungry planet for kind of sustainable, high welfare, smaller farming operations. And we're not out to put those folks out of business. That said, I think those types of operations, it's difficult to scale them and maintain their more sustainable, good for the animal qualities. And so I think there needs to be a way to provide large quantities of affordable, delicious, and safe meat. And that is where I think cellular agriculture companies can come in. The second thing I would add is that in addition to collaborations in regards to the feed that we give the cells so that they grow, I think there's also opportunities perhaps a little bit more limited in scope in terms of sourcing the initial cells. And how expansive these types of partnerships can be will depend on the specific strategies that companies use in terms of having cells that indefinitely self-renew or returning to the animals periodically. I know at Memphis Meats, our goal is to totally remove the animal from the equation. So we won't need, our goal is to not be returning to animals regularly for new cell samples. But the initial samples will require animals to obtain the initial cells. And in fact, we're at Memphis Meats, we just launched a recruiting campaign, and we're looking to grow the team. And one of the jobs that we're looking for is a cell procurement specialist. And so that person would work with external partners, potentially including farmers, to source those initial cells. So I think those are some additional opportunities for collaboration.
And Mark, you are working on a pilot project, correct, with some farmers?
Yeah.
You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's basically a regionally initiated project, and it's supported by the regional government, where we have basically the money to work with farmers and with feed producers to start an experiment. And it hasn't started yet. We are still in the preparation phase. But it's interesting that both the regional government and the university and the company and the farmers and the feed producers are kind of aligned to work on this particular experiment. So and that's what it is. It's an experiment. But it also, in my mind, creates sort of the narrative that this is one potential way to go. I want to remark on one thing that David said, and so yeah, you can focus on, we're focusing on factory farming. But the fact of the matter is we don't live in an isolated world. So if we affect the production system somewhere, it's going to affect the production system elsewhere also. So I don't really have the illusion, and I don't want to give that illusion that smallholder farms and are safe, because I don't think that eventually is going to happen. It's one big system.
What do the farmers think about that?
No, I'm quite aware of Mark's opinion on that, and he's always been really open about that, which is good. I just think it's an ongoing debate, and after the conference last year, I said to Isha, I didn't think there was enough balance into the discussion, and maybe this isn't the forum for it, I'm not sure, but I congratulate her for asking some farmers along to be part of that discussion. So, yeah, long story short, I don't. My worldview probably isn't the same, but I think it's an interesting discussion, and there is real challenges around feeding lots of people and doing it sustainably. So, yeah.
Do we have a responsibility to protect our farmers, to ensure that our small farmers, that we're supporting them, they're stewards of the soil and our water? Just from your personal perspective.
I don't actually see it that way myself, like a welfare system sort of thing. If like I said at the start, if there's a genuinely better way of feeding the world food, and it's not agriculture or not conventional agriculture, then why would we keep going? And there's other ways to look after the land, which doesn't involve farmers. But I guess fundamentally I don't believe that at the moment. So that's why I don't necessarily agree. I think it can be done sustainably, and I think in a lot of cases it is. Like New Zealand, our biggest farmer, Landcorp, they've pledged within 10 years to be carbon neutral. And there's a whole lot of techniques and technologies out there that I don't think are very well represented in the life cycle analysis now, which I think, which will be, if they're factored in the future, will change the numbers a bit. So, yeah, I'm actually pretty optimistic about the future of agriculture as it stands now. But yeah, some things need to change. Maybe the likes of the big factory farming. But I can also see where this technology could, where the two could coexist.
Well, I quite agree with what Mark says, that nothing is really safe. There's two things to consider in that if you think of the natural environment of specific land, for us here in Wales, it rains a lot, grass grows, so we produce a lot of lamb. So does New Zealand. But you're limited to that land, to what you can produce from it, and if that isn't economically viable, then that won't be produced. But farmers have another role other than just producing food. We look after the land, and that's an environmental consequence. So, yes, there is. If an industry is to be decimated by something, there's a portion of responsibility, especially if part of the key driver is climate change and environment. So, as we are in Europe, we have subsidies to look after the land in terms of environment as it is. For us in the UK, it might be slightly different post-Brexit. And for the rest of Europe, in a few years' time, it's different for you in New Zealand. But there is a weight of responsibility on farmers to do that. What happens in the future is a different matter, because you can't just, if you're not farming, what are you doing with all that land? Right. So, is it looking at rewilding? Is it looking at utilising livestock for land management, but with much smaller herds? So, there's a transitional period to get to a different type of agriculture.
That's a great segue into my next question, which was, what should we be considering as we introduce cultured meat into the food economy? And what potential unintended social, environmental, health consequences may we deal with that we're not really thinking about right now or talking about yet?
I think one thing that's really important to consider is just to make sure that we're constantly communicating with folks at all levels of the supply chain, and in particular the end consumer. We want to make sure we're not in a position where folks feel like they're being deceived, or we pulled the wool over their eyes, or the synthetic wool over their eyes maybe is more appropriate. And I think as long as we're transparent and as long as we're speaking with folks and telling them what it is we're doing and why it is we think this is so important, then that will be very helpful.
Yeah, you can look at this from a very sort of holistic perspective, right? And that's something that we definitely need to do. I have not seen really a very good sort of systematic analysis of what would happen if you would, let's say, exchange 50% of livestock meat farming to a cultured meat variant, or whatever ratio. What would happen to the water? What would happen to jobs? What would happen to the land? And energy. We don't have those systematic analysis, and it would be really fun to have them, and would be really good to have them. We don't. Currently. There's always a lot of talk about land, and what is going to happen to the land if you suddenly have a lot of land available that you no longer need for food production. And I keep thinking, wait a minute, we came from that situation, right? We came from a situation where we didn't need a lot of land because we had a smaller population. So why would be so worried about that? So I come from the Netherlands, where no square centimeter of land is unused. It's scary. If you go through that landscape, it's really, you cannot find a patch of land that's not used. And if I come to the US, finally I see wasteland. And so, nobody worries about the wasteland. And nobody worries in the Netherlands that there's no wasteland, except for me, I guess. So for me, it's it's kind of almost a theoretical discussion where we came from that situation. Right?
What about you?
To me, I think the thing to be mindful of is just the claims that are being made around what I'm calling synthetic food at the moment, and just challenge to everyone to really test them in your own minds and do your own research on them, I guess. Personally, I think there's a fair bit of art in going into them at the moment, and it's pretty easy to get some, basic information off YouTube or off Google and draw a picture of what's happening in the world. But like Illtud alluded to at the start, there's a lot of different farming systems out there, and it's not quite that simple, sort of thing, to paint agriculture with the same brush. So that would be my challenge, I guess, and the thing we need to be aware of, because we could make a whole lot of decisions based on what we think is true, and then in 50, 100 years look back and think, man, that was a bad decision. So
I'm quite interested in seeing how the meat industry will respond to the democratization of utilising carcasses, because at the moment we're limited by what an animal produces from the cuts, the yield balance of an animal. So it'll be a major shift for the meat industry to change in that way. And the other thing is food culture, because food culture is extremely important to every nation in the world, and how we incorporate new food into that culture, if we're actually responsive and courteous to somebody's traditional food culture, and whether we can sort of introduce this new food into that in a certain way. I think that's key, really, to kind of all that engagement.
If you think about the key priority areas, right, for both of you, as you're both involved with companies, research that's kind of pioneering the future of this industry, what do you think, what questions do you want people to be asking as they're sending this technology out into the world, right, where you're getting out of the lab and you're having people consuming it? What questions do you think that we should be asking before we unleash this into the world?
One important question is that is on everybody's mind, at least the people I talk to, is safety, both short-term and long-term, because it is a new product, and it is produced in a different way, so how can you guarantee that this is safe now and is safe in the long term? So that is something that we really need to be concerned about. The other thing is, we are having a somewhat theoretical discussion here based on the assumption, which is at this point still an assumption that Dave's company and our company and a couple of others that are starting and will start are actually capable of producing the same quality that these wonderful guys are creating. And so when I talk to farmers, they sort of look at me with empathy and are you really thinking that you can create those same products? I don't think so. And that's a very healthy concern, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's also important just to be constantly asking why. I think all the folks, at least that I'm aware of in this movement so far, are really passionately driven by the mission of creating a better world. And I think we just want to make sure that that continues and that we're communicating that well to the general public.
Going back to Mark's point, what I find quite interesting is our fixation with producing meat. So for me as a food producer, what this technology allows us is to produce a new ingredient. So if we lift that constraint of meat, that the world's our oyster in terms of what we can produce from this. That perfect steak may well be the end goal, but in between there's going to be different iterations of protein ingredients before we get to that. So that to me is what excites me about the field.
You're just much more forward thinking than we are. No, but I can see that. But my feeling is, and it's not more than a feeling, I don't really have anything to support this, is that in order to familiarize the general public with this idea, you don't want to throw all sorts of futuristic scenarios with new products and sort of unheard of products at this moment. So it's more like a strategic choice than that we lack the imagination, I hope.
Semantics is interesting in this space because I think, whenever we post on Twitter anything about cellular agriculture, we have so many farmers reaching out to us, really hurt, especially around the use of the term clean meat, for example, where it's very polarizing, and it feels, for a lot of farmers, they feel really hurt that the assumption is, well, is their meat not clean? So I'm just curious about, number one, your take on the term clean meat, and also how we change the conversation a little bit. I know you just published a paper on your research about how we need to engage farmers in a conversation so that they are at least exploring this technology and what it might mean for them. So your feedback on the term clean meat and just how we engage farmers in these conversations in a more inclusive way.
I don't think we yet have a term for the product because I don't particularly like either cultured nor clean. Personal experience of dealing with customers when I've explained to them what this technology is and used the term clean, they've had that instant reaction of thinking that what they're regularly buying is dirty. So that connotation, we want this needs to be an inclusive technology, not something that alienates. So I don't think we yet have that name. Don't know what it's going to be either. So
at Memphis Meats, we think of what we're doing as just producing meat, plain and simple. That said, I think the term clean meat makes sense in terms of its allusion to the lesser environmental impact and the lower risk of bacterial contamination. I also think, the fundamental question here maybe is, can you refer to something in a positive way without also kind of backhand insulting the alternative product? And I think you can. I mean, I think, if I go into, your office and say your desk is clean, it doesn't mean mine is dirty necessarily. So I think I don't see any problem there, and many of the folks we've engaged in the agribusiness industry think that have used the term clean meat happily.
I'm somewhat indifferent, to be honest. I'm not too interested in what name we use for this, because my impression is that through surveys, having used very different terms like lab-grown or in vitro meat or cultured meat or clean meat, the outcome is actually very similar, more similar than divergent. So in my mind, none of these terms have at this stage sort of turned away the general public from this idea. And so that sort of comforts me and say, well, I'm not going to have long debates about this and waste my time on the correct nomenclature. One of the very pragmatic issues I have with clean meat, you cannot translate it in Dutch. So because it really looks like meat that has been treated with a detergent. But that's my only pragmatic sort of objection against the term.
Yeah, I'll probably along similar lines to Illtud there. That I think it has connotations that traditional meat is somehow dirty if you're producing clean meat. But again, I guess I had a bit of pushback terming everything under the same umbrella, calling it synthetic food when I was looked at plant-based alternatives and cell-cultured food and all sorts. So people said to me, well, it's not synthetic, it's called cell culture and that sort of thing. And I really just did that because that's what people related to at home, and no one really has talked about clean meat yet, but yeah, that might be coming. So I might get hammered on that one too.
One thing I would add just on the terminology question, I think one thing that there seems to be fairly broad consensus is not a good term to use is something like lab-grown meat, just because it's incredibly misleading. Virtually every, and I apologize if folks have heard this analogy before, but virtually every packaged food starts in a lab during the research and development phase, but the food that folks are actually eating is produced in a factory. And so, cornflakes, for instance, is a favorite analogy. That started in a lab, but it's produced in factories. So lab-grown meat, I think, is lab-grown to the same extent we would call cornflakes lab-grown cornflakes.
We have some really great questions coming in, so I'm going to switch to the audience questions. This first one, so Mark and David, for your company, what is open shared and what is not? How do you determine if something should be patented?
So far we haven't patented anything, and so far everybody can come into our lab, not all at the same time, to copy what we're doing. Having said that, we are now at the stage where investors come in and the story changes a little bit because we need to, at some point, show that we can return some of those investments, and that may require patenting. There are a couple of initiatives, most importantly by the Good Food Institute, to try and come up with ways where actually the patenting doesn't really hold up the development, so that you can, at least among the companies, keep on working on the stuff that is patented by the others. And then when it comes to commercialization, you can use the patent to get return of your investment. But one of the big concerns that we have, I think, is that patenting shouldn't hold up the development in these companies.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think open source academic research is incredibly important, and I'm hugely grateful for the folks doing that. At the same time, I think everybody would agree that if these products don't ultimately get onto a shelf or onto a menu, then we don't have access to any of the impacts that we're looking for. And so even if the only thing you care about is helping the environment or helping animals or improving public health, there needs to be a profit incentive in order to garner some of these partnerships and investments. And so the decision to patent or not patent is something that I think really needs to take that profit incentive into consideration, even if you're operating 100% from a social mission motivation.
It's 2050, lab meat is everywhere. Describe our new relationship with animals in the natural world.
Why are you looking at me? Well, it's So we have heard this morning that we have 40 billion animals on 9 billion people or 7 billion people. So these animals are all here because of us, and because we use them for our purpose. If we no longer need them for that purpose, they will decline in number. It's sort of, if you know, in terms of if you've ever read the book of Michael Pollan about the botany of desire, you understand that these animals kind of co-evoluted with us. They have traits that humans like, and that allows them to grow in really, really large numbers. If they no longer have those traits, they will dwindle in numbers. Then they will be kept as pets or as wildlife, and I can imagine that will happen.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I guess ultimately the number of farm animals would decline, but yeah, I wonder how, like ultimately in a wild population, the amount of animals is governed by how much food there is, so starvation and predators manage the population, so yeah, I guess ultimately how that plays out, I'm not sure, but it's a good question. Do we end up with a whole lot of animals that running the street because we're not allowed to kill them and we're not allowed to manage them? I'm not sure. Good question.
I think there will still be a market for people will still want, or some people will still want to eat meat. And so even if the affordability of cultured meat becomes cheap enough to pass the cost of meat, there will still be a population that will want that. So I can't see there being, with so many generations to this point of domestication of animals, I can't quite see in one generation that we can undo all that.
Is that because you're assuming that no way we can achieve the same quality?
No, not at all. I just think that people will still want to have that.
I understand. My question, and I'm usually not allowed to say that by PR people, but I'm going to do it anyway. You know, if you have equal sort of quality products with comparable prices, let's say 30 years from now, I cannot see how they coexist, because you know it's in a way. So my big example is caged eggs in the EU, right? So caged eggs have been around for a long time, and then they got free-range eggs, and the only difference between the two is animal welfare, basically. And they were slightly more expensive, the free-range eggs. In the course of 20-25 years, consumers have massively steered away from caged eggs, up to the point that the EU, not known for its decisiveness, has banned caged eggs from the market. And in my mind, something like this will happen too if we are capable of reproducing the same, and that's the big assumption here, producing the same quality products with a comparable price. Then at some point, animal welfare will tip it over.
I agree in the mainstream that will happen, but I just can't see how you can do culture. You know, for me, our family business, we've farmed for over 300 years in the same farm. And the way that I started a meat business was through the tradition of the annual slaughter on the farm of the animals that would be our food for the year. And that's a part of heritage that goes from one generation to the next. Perhaps in the long term, yes, we can get with that can change. But by 2050, that's so very near that you know, hopefully that's still within my lifetime, that I can't see how I can undo my own food culture within that period. And equally for those within, you know, the next generation that are still a part of that. I mean, our food cultures are being eroded, no doubt of that. I mean, we're moving towards convenience food, where we cook a lot less, we understand far less about where our food comes from, and in some part this has actually taken us much further as well. But there will be, you know, it's actually there will be a small percentage of population that will still be an inherent part of their culture.
Yeah, but no. But I guess we have seen professions dying out because they are exchanged by another technology, like the postman, for instance. Now, Postman probably doesn't really, although my name suggests otherwise, doesn't move through a family. And then, there are, and I can understand that this for you is a very real thing, this whole history and family development. But on the other hand, there are so many professions that are sort of dying out because that also maybe went from person to person.
I mean, agriculture is already there. If we think of subsidy in the EU, if I look at my fellow farmers in Wales, if we weren't getting subsidy, we'd be making a loss. So it's we're already at that point where it's not financially viable to farm, or food is not actually at the cost that it should be at.
Right.
So there are two things there. But culturally, a lot of farmers keep on doing what they do because it's a generational thing. My uncle probably wouldn't have wanted to be a farmer, but he was the eldest son, and so through succession he became a farmer. He would have been better as an academic. He pushed me away from agriculture, but I decided to come back to it. So there's this cultural thing within agriculture. You're within a silo that you don't see the wider world. It's relatively rare that people like Richard and myself get that opportunity to go out there and see what we see and then bring it back. And so these are really hardened communities, and to change that is very, very difficult. And that's why I think the whole conversation of, we always talk about engaging the consumer, but the farmer is a ridiculously important person to engage with in this whole process, because they're often the people that are forgotten within this. They're never really engaged within conventional intensive agriculture. Like you said, they're entrepreneurs, they go for where the money is. So they really have that choice. They really have an input into it. So there's an opportunity here for us to actually do something about that, rather than you just ignore that silo of people and carry on.
And I would argue that actually the consumer also really cares about the farmer now. I mean, the top 25 food companies lost $18 billion in market share, and that's because people care about where their food comes from, who grows it, what it's going to do to their body, what it's going to do to the planet. So I think that definitely, is another area that we have to be thinking about.
They retained 980 trillion of that 980 billion of that share, right? That's because it used to be 1 trillion.
But the small and medium-sized businesses are growing, took 46% of growth. So I think, people want to know the stories. They want to feel good. The number of people that are visiting farmers markets or doing boxes, they care about the stories of their farmers. Just a point to add. I think, sorry, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, bring in one more industry here, and that's the horse-drawn carriage industry. That's one that saw a significant disruption with the invention of the car and the assembly line. But there still exists, kind of for a more niche market than it used to be, opportunities to use a horse-drawn carriage. So I think it is very likely that there will always be some sort of animal farming out there. I think the question that we're trying to solve is, does it have to be factory farming?
Do you think that cellular agriculture can promote economic development for working class people, or is it going to be something that is more likely to lead to concentrated corporate wealth?
Probably not my space here, but can I just say the first reason I was keen to look at cellular agriculture was because I look, milking cows every day and stuff, it's hard work, and it's, you think, is there a better way of doing this? So I looked at it as an opportunity, really, and probably done, yeah. So I'd like to think there is possibly, but whether I'm not sure. My gut feel is probably looking at how the rest of the food world evolves, with big corporates and stuff. My gut feel is that probably not at that small scale.
Well, that's actually an interesting point, because I thought about this while having a discussion on, do you want to go back to animals to get samples, and nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to. It's hard work, as you said. It's hard work to milk a cow, and it may be much lighter work to operate a brewing kettle, right? And it's less smelly, it's less, it's less hazardous. It's you don't get kicked by the kettle. Kettle, as in K. I have to be careful here. That's actually a good point. And that may, for future generations, may be even more important. That changing the way and already the way farms has changed, I guess, sort of pointed that direction, changing the way we produce these in ways that are actually nicer for the workers in that industry.
I think there will be a lot of working class jobs created by this new industry. And I think there's really two categories of jobs. There's the ones that require pretty specialized expertise in a scientific area, and those are like the jobs that we're looking for now. But as we scale, there will also be, I think, a lot of opportunities in manufacturing. You know, these facilities, once we're producing at scale, will be comparable to beer breweries. And that will require some human labor. Some of it will be automated for safety reasons in part, but there will be job opportunities there. And so I think there will be opportunities for the working class.
And so will your company be supporting training, and are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't want to make any guarantees on behalf of Memphis Meats right now, but I know it's something that's very top of mind for everybody on the team.
So Marianne, who spoke this morning, and I have a spin-out business. We're looking at cultured meat research in the UK, and I think a key part of what we're looking at is understanding the opportunity for agriculture in the UK. And part of that research is to create a model farm, so that we're interested in the idea of keeping animals, in taking primary cells, because we believe in the biodiversity of all the different breeds of animals, and what all those breeds can bring to this new technology. And so the idea of continuing agriculture and continuing standard jobs that we have within agriculture will remain for us. And the one key thing for me, the thing I've been relatively fixated within agriculture, is realizing the value of a cell. Because until now, everything is free, because everything is a byproduct. If we keep animals for the future, they need to have that value. If I look wider, part of what I looked at during my inner-field study was the more holistic approach to agriculture, and the work of people like the Savory Institute in utilising large ruminant animals to manage land, where you have vast swathes of land, but it's purely an environmental management, so that any meat that is derived from those animals is a byproduct of that system, rather than animals being actually farmed to produce meat. So there are viable sort of possibilities for animal agriculture where you need jobs, because in mimicking that kind of movement of large ruminant animals, if you think of the bison in the plains, here they would have moved because of natural predators, but nowadays that would mean moving them either through fencing or through sort of humans moving them. So there's definitely a role within that type of environmental management and agricultural livestock provision. So yeah.
Should cellular agriculture be non-GMO?
Yes. At least in Europe. Our surveys show that and they're in Europe, that the combination of cultured meat and GMO at this point, I say at this point, is killing. And that's not to say that that's the same in 20 years from now, but at this point, it would be killing.
Our products to date have not used any genetic engineering. That said, we're keeping an open mind, and we're keeping everything on the table. At the end of the day, I think we're going to evaluate whatever research strategies will have the best positive impact on the world in terms of the environment, the animals, and of course, human health.
Why clean meat? Please describe the benefits of scaling up clean meat versus plant-based meat.
I think there's a role for both to play, and I'm very excited about some of the new innovations in the plant-based meat industry. I think these products are getting incredibly sophisticated and really tasty, and I think that's very good, and they are going to do a lot of good in the world. That said, I do think that there is a large segment of the population that is going to insist on eating animal tissue, which is perhaps not how folks typically think of the meat they're eating, but that is what it is. And I think it's important that folks have opportunities for those types of products as well.
Completely agree with you. In terms of consumers buy on price. Consumers want to eat what they want to eat. You know, the value that they place on food has changed completely. If we looked at the 1950s, over 50% of wages were spent on food, and now it's below 10%. So they really don't have that they're not invested in the same way in what they purchase. So I don't think people will change because of environmental reasons, climate change, animal welfare. It's actually, if you look nowadays at what people are buying, it shows that they want to eat more protein and animal protein at that. So, yeah.
Yeah, at the conference in Maastricht 5 weeks ago, Chris Bryan showed this slide that he got from the internet of a supermarket in Houston during Harvey, where people have been bunking down before the storm, and so all the shelves are empty except for the meat substitute shelf. And it's kind of hilarious, but it's also somewhat sad, because it shows you that there is still, although we have known about the issues about meat production for 35 or longer years, and it's still apparently very hard for people to convert to a vegetable-based diet, although we perfectly can. There's no need for animal proteins for most of us, at least. But it seems to be very hard. So my big concern is, are we going to be able to transform to a plant-based diet fast enough, so that we can accommodate the meat production issues that we are going to face in 2050. So that's why, I think we need to bet on all the horses that we can have out there, and eventually leave it to the consumer what type of product they want to eat in 2050.
Can I make a point about that slide from Houston? One problem that we have is that we're not integrating those types of products with meat products. As an example, in the UK, when soya milk was introduced in supermarkets, it was in the aisle as a shelf-stable product, in the same place you get UHT milk and an orange juice. It wasn't until they put it into the chill section next to the milk that people started buying it, because they thought of it as being an alternative to milk. If meat substitutes still have their own little section within the refrigerated counter away from the meat, people will never go and buy something from that. If they're carnivores, if it's in the middle of everything else, even if they buy it as a mistake and they eat it and they like it, it's a way of getting them to start buying it.
Well, unfortunately, that's our time. Thank you all so much, and thank you all for having us.